So Katie and her Audrey, I title this message, A True Acceptance of God's Grace. And it's taken really for the most part from Psalm 51, verses 16 and 17. And I consider these to be in the top 10 of some of the most profound verses in the entire Word of God. And I'll give you just a little overview real quick. This is King David, right after Nathan the prophet has exposed him in his adultery with Bathsheba and in the murder of Bathsheba's husband in order to cover up her pregnancy. And this has been made known, obviously, to David, his household, and most likely the nation of Israel. So everybody's in the know of what David has done here. And if that weren't enough, he's just lost his firstborn son from this woman as part of God's judgment. And so David is beside himself. And he is driven as a result of these things to what I would consider to be some extremely profound thoughts and or ideas. And so I start with verse 16 of Psalm 51. And this is David, and he says that, and I'm paraphrasing, God does not care so much about sacrifice, or you, Lord, don't care so much about sacrifice as you care, and this is verse 17, about a broken and contrite heart. That is a broken and sorry heart. Such a heart you will not despise. Such a heart you will not reject. And this is unbelievable that David says this, because he's making this statement, really, in the bowels of the sacrificial system, when people routinely sacrificed animals in order to atone for their sin. And of course, God instituted all of this. But the fact that David understands that ultimately man is not made right before God by sacrifice is unbelievable. He's basically saying the same thing that Isaiah several hundred years later would say when God ordained him to be a prophet. And you recall, as I'd stated previously, that Isaiah wasn't hanging out at the steak joint with a woman under each of his shoulders celebrating that God had chosen him. Isaiah was most likely flat on his face and in despair because he realized that the God that he thought he knew all his life was not really the God who was. And that caused Isaiah to be driven to make the statement that all of our righteousness, not just some, all of our righteousness is as filthy rags. He's saying the same thing several hundred years later that David said previously in Psalm 51, which is that God doesn't care so much about sacrifice as he does about a broken and contrite heart. And certainly Paul in the New Testament, several hundred years after Isaiah, would say the same thing in what I consider to be the flagship two verses of the entire Word of God. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not of yourself, not by works. I love this. So that no man may boast. All three men, if we want to really look at this, are saying the same thing. That God is not so concerned with our acts of righteousness. How could he be, right? He's an infinite God, as he is concerned with our act of surrender. And that's what all three of these individuals had in common. They were all driven through life's circumstances, David included, obviously. That's what this message is about. To the realization, the painful, terrible, horrendous realization that at the end of the day, God was more concerned with our hearts surrendering to him than he was with our supposedly good deeds before him. And that's what it's all about. That's, I think, the attitude that we have to have that underlies a true acceptance of God's grace. Little lengthy, little broken in the thoughts, but I think you both get it. God bless you both.